Javën arkitekturës për hapjen mas ekspozitës që kemi pasur në të entit për asociacionin të arkitektëve, jemi të hapë me ligjëratën e Vladimir Kulićin, e cili është profesor i historisë dhe teorisë të arkitekturës në Universitetin e Floridës në Miami. Që është interesant, e ka studiu Vladimiri gjithsesht historinë e modernizmit jugoslav, ndoshta një pjesë, ndoshta në Kosovo nuk janë edhe qaq të njoftuar, por gjithsesi që kanë qenë të prekun. Ligjërata e sot më ka më fokusu në një personalitet që ndoshta prapë nuk e njohim kaq mirë, po është një prej personave edhe arkitektat më me influencë edhe transition në arkitekturën slovene, ajo është Vladimir Kulić. Pa dash në zgjatë shumë se pak se vëmë me orar, kisha pas qef me fëtu Vladimir. Vladimir, please, gracias.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, George. Thank you, everyone, for welcoming me to the Architecture Week. I'm super excited to be in Pristina. I only passed once by train through the city, so and today I was really anxious to prepare for the lecture, so I'm really hoping to get out and see more tomorrow during the day. Also, thank you to many people from whom I learned about the topic that I'm going to talk about today, including my colleague Arber Siddiqui, who sent me an image that you're going to see a little bit later. Why should I talk about Ravnikar? There are much bigger experts on Ravnikar than me, Professor Vodopets and many other people in Ljubljana certainly know more about Ravnikar, and now that Aljosha is here, I'm especially anxious that I'm kind of stepping onto territory that's not exactly my very narrow specialty. But there are several reasons. One is really pragmatic. One is that I just finished a book chapter on Ravnikar, so it's very fresh. So I'm still in it, and I hope we perhaps have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. But a more important reason is that Ravnikar built in Pristina, as well as in many other parts of former Yugoslavia, as well as abroad. So he was someone who very much participated in shaping of a modern architectural identity of the former Yugoslavia, and specifically of Slovenia. And there's something really interesting about the way in which Ravnikar shaped that Slovenian identity. It's a really kind of interesting phenomenon, because it shows us the degree to which modern national identity is actually a very modern thing and a very constructed thing. Ravnikar built it by referring to specifically modernist sources of the 20th century, perhaps late 19th century, rather than to some kind of distant past that we normally sort of associate with construction of national identities. And in that sense, it's really interesting, I think, for everyone, all of us in the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, are still struggling with this kind of construction of national identities through architecture in particular. And Ravnikar's lesson is really to the point that it's really a modern identity can be constructed out of entirely modern sources. And modern architecture culture does not really have to appeal to any kind of mythical distant past in order to construct a really efficient and clear architectural culture. Ravnikar is also really interesting as a person that we might see as an heir to Penick. Of course, Penick is the first national architect of Slovenia, who very much shaped Ljubljana to the point that Ljubljana is known as Penick's Ljubljana. You see tourist advertisements of Penick's Ljubljana. Penick was also extremely influential as a teacher, but we could say pretty much the same for Ravnikar as well. Ravnikar shaped some of the most important spaces of the city of Ljubljana, including the main city square, today the Republic Square that you see in the upper left, and several other important buildings. And even more importantly, Ravnikar really shaped the architectural profession in a very profound way. I think it's rather astonishing. When I first sort of counted the number and realized, I was completely flabbergasted when I realized that Ravnikar had no less than 659 graduates at the School of Architecture in Ljubljana, which is a staggering number, right? Slovenia is a country of about 2 million altogether. More than 600 architects were educated directly under Ravnikar's mentorship, which really tells you to what degree he was influential towards shaping the architecture culture of post-war Slovenia. Ravnikar also, as I mentioned, built all over the former Yugoslavia. Here's the School of Electrical Engineering here in Pristina. Thank you, Albert, for sending me this drawing. We find him in Skopje as early as the 1940s. Here's another educational facility. He did other projects for Skopje in the 60s. I'm going to show you a couple later. We find him in Montenegro. He designed the master plan for the coast around Budva and south of Budva towards Sveti Stefan. He even had one realization, the Maestral Hotel in Pržno. And we find him working internationally. We find him winning international competitions, perhaps one of the most successful Yugoslav architects on the international scene. His award-winning project for the Troncheto area in Venice that you see here, and then the really, really interesting story of the Babylon Hotel in Baghdad that was constructed after his design. The story is really incredibly interesting. I don't have the time now to go into details, but today it's claimed to be a modern ziggurat, right? This repository of ancient Iraqi identity, right? It looks like an ancient ziggurat. It's in yellow brick, right? The material of ancient Mesopotamia. But then it's very surprising when you realize that the project was actually designed originally for Montenegro, for the coast. It was supposed to, its shape was actually supposed to mimic the mountains on the Montenegrin coast, and when it got transferred through the networks of the non-aligned movement to Baghdad, to Iraq, it acquired this completely different new meaning. I'm going to start at the beginning, in a way, with Ravnikar's education, his formative experiences, and his early career that was pretty much defined by two formative influences. Ravnikar was a student, perhaps the most influential student of Penick, but early in his career he also worked for Le Corbusier for a few months in Paris. And out of these two very disparate sources, he started constructing sort of a hybrid architecture that appealed to both of them. What's really interesting in this case is that these two influences were really different to the point of being incompatible. Allegedly, Penick really disliked Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, on the other hand, really liked Penick's students, many of whom worked in his office. He liked them because they could draw perfectly. So it was kind of a bit of a tense marriage of influences between these two architects. Penick, who was a much more traditionalist, especially in this late phase of his career, and Le Corbusier, the avant-garde rationalist architect, looking forward to lead the world into modernity, into the 20th century. Ravnikar, already in this early phase of his career, managed sort of to mix these two seemingly incompatible influences, but he also managed to find the overlaps. You would not think that there's much that could overlap between Plečnik and Le Corbusier, but there were certain areas, and Ravnikar was very good about figuring out what is it that they have in common and then exploiting these commonalities in his work. So in this early phase, Ravnikar is really an epigone, right? A follower of these two great formative figures. He studied with Plečnik at the newly founded School of Architecture in Ljubljana. Soon after he, or pretty much as soon as he graduated, Plečnik hired him to work on one of his really most important masterpieces, the National University Library in Ljubljana. And Ravnikar's first own project that he designed on his own really reflects very clearly the fact that he's a student of Plečnik. It's an ossuary at the Žale cemetery in Ljubljana, and it's very much a kind of recombination of different motifs from Plečnik's work. It's a rotunda, very much resembling the rotunda of the Church of St. Anthony's in Belgrade that Plečnik designed in the 30s. But then if you look closely at the entrance, it very closely resembles the entrance to the Church of St. Michael's in Barje in Slovenia. The texture of the wall, if you look closely again, you will see this kind of irregular, very, very rustic texture of the wall, which again could link to projects like the National University Library. So he's pretty much a good student of Plečnik. In the spring of 1939, however, Ravnikar goes to Paris to work for Le Corbusier. He only spent about 3 months or so. I again now have to extend my thanks to another colleague, to Bogo Zupancic, who did a lot of research on Slovenian architects in Le Corbusier's office. There were many. There were several others from other parts of Yugoslavia, most notably Juraj Neidhardt and Ernst Weissmann from Zagreb. But Plečnik students, as I mentioned, had special reputation in Le Corbusier's office because of their incredible drafting skills. That's what Plečnik really taught them how to do well. And here we find two drawings that were most likely drafted by Ravnikar for Le Corbusier's office. Le Corbusier was working on a big project for Algiers, which we see here on the right. And there's a copy of Le Corbusier's book that contains the little note drawn by Edward Ravnikar, which allegedly Le Corbusier did not want to sign in appreciation of Ravnikar's excellent drafting skills. He was such a skilled draftsman that would not want to put his own signature in order to honor Ravnikar's work. Soon after his arrival back in Ljubljana from Paris, Ravnikar starts working on his first hybrid project in which he combines the lessons of Plečnik and of Corbu. He won the competition for the Modern Gallery, which, when you see it from afar, looks like a simple white functionalist box, especially when you see this porch here. Okay, the screen is not showing my cursor, so I have to wave my arms. So the porch here with the railing that looks like the railing from a boat looks very functionalist, right? But when we get closer and start analyzing the details, we see a rather rich texture of the wall. We see the stylized acroteria on the roof, those little classical bumps, right, that a functionalist architect would never put on the building. And then especially when we get much closer to the wall, we again see these funny overlaps. There's a very rich texture to this wall, but the grid actually seems to come out of Le Corbusier's work. We could perhaps compare the coarsework, right? The way the stone is laid to some of Corbusier's 1930s projects, like the Pavillon Suisse in Paris. However, it's not the smooth, functionalist, purist Corbusian facade. There's a wealth of different textures, smooth, embossed, rather rustic, etc., which obviously owes to Le Corbusier's, to Plečnik's sensibility. Also, when you see here, look at the windows on the right, you will notice these little columns, kind of very stylized, simplified little columns in the middle of the windows, which is a very much Plečnik motif. Plečnik really liked doing things like that, like putting on a column in the middle of an opening, which is a big classical no-no, right? Alberti said that there should be always an even number of columns in a building, right? Because columns are legs, like legs in an animal. So you should always have 2 or 4 or an even number of columns. An odd number of columns, no. Plečnik really liked playing with that, so he would often have an odd number of columns, put the column right in the middle of the window to sort of deliberately subvert the rules of classicism. We see that same motif here in the windows of the modern gallery. So already a hybrid, right? There's a little bit of Corbu, there's a little bit of Plečnik, but the sources are still quite recognizable, right? The motifs are recognizable. We still see how Ravnikar mixes and matches these influences. The same story sort of continues after World War II. During the war, Ravnikar does not produce very much, although he did design the logo of the Osvobodilna Fronta, the Liberation Front of Slovenia. He got imprisoned. He was sent to a camp in Sicily. And after the war, he acquires very prominent positions in Slovenia and starts participating in the reconstruction of the country right away. And here we see him pretty much winning the competition for New Belgrade, which was supposed to be the new capital of Yugoslavia, an optimistic endeavor, a new heart of a new state that was going to be more just than the interwar kingdom. And a big competition is organized for a master plan of the new city, as well as for some key buildings, including the headquarters of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, the presidency of the federal government, and several others. There's no first prize, so Tito and the leadership is not exactly happy with what they got, but Ravnikar wins the second prize, the highest ranking. So he was really the best ranked architect at the competition. His plan for New Belgrade is really, really Corbusian. This is pretty much the radiant city, right? In its basic concept, adapted for state administration, right? We see the treatment of space, right, with freestanding buildings, freestanding blocks submerged in greenery, and instead of the business area with the high-rise towers, at the top we see the most important state buildings, and the very center is the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which you see here through the window to the left. Now, if you remember this perspective that he drew for Le Corbusier, you will get really the degree to which this influence plays out already here. However, it's a really tricky moment in Yugoslavia. It's 1947. Yugoslavia is very, very closely allied to the Soviet Union. politically, Le Corbusier is not exactly the best reference. Really, what the party leadership pushes for is socialist realism, right? It's Moscow, it's the Palace of the Soviets, it's big sculptures with workers, with fists clenched. In a way, Ravnica understands that he needs to make some concessions to this need for explicit political representation. So if you look closely at this building, this modernist tower that he designs, you will actually notice that there are some figures at the very top, just like you would see at the infamous Palace of the Soviets in Moscow that was never finished, the model of socialist realism. But the way in which these figures are treated are not Soviet at all. They're again Corbusian. In the 20s, in 27, Corbu does the really infamous project for the Palace of the League of Nations, right, where he proposes this massive new complex. He's awarded the first prize, and then through scheming behind the scenes, disqualified because he was considered too avant-garde. When we analyze the Palace of the League of Nations, we see that there's a similar kind of treatment of sculptural group to the one that Ravnica designs for New Belgrade. There are other similarities. For example, here the presidency of the government in New Belgrade. Look at these medallions above the entrance. I assume they were supposed to have the coats of arms of the Yugoslav Republic. Very much similar to Corbu's project for the Mindanao, again in Geneva in 27, in conjunction with the Palace of the League of Nations. However, Tito is not happy with the results, doesn't like any of the projects that were submitted. He really wants Greek columns. He wants the seat of the Communist Party to look like a prow of a ship that's sort of leading into the future. And Ravnica writes an article about that because he was present at the meeting with Tito, and he says that Comrade Tito told them that the headquarters of the Central Committee of the Communist Party should project this optimism and victory of socialism and should have Greek columns. So at the second round of the competition, he understands that he needs to make concessions to socialist realism, to Soviet sources. So he kind of brings in another source. This is the second round of the competition. His new project, which is not very Corbusian anymore. It literally looks like a ship, right, that's going to sail into the river. And the source now is really Soviet. This is pretty much one of the paradigmatic projects of Soviet socialist realism, the pavilion of the USSR in Paris at the International Exposition in 1937 by Boris Yofan, which we see sort of adapted here. Of course, what happens just a year later, we all know the story. In 1948, Yugoslavia is pretty much kicked out of the Soviet orbit. There's the famous Tito's note to Stalin, right? And that's pretty much the end of socialist realism. This kind of political incursion really into architecture no longer works. And that opens up a really exciting period in architecture in all of Yugoslavia, where all kinds of new tasks are put forth for the architects, and there's now a field of experimentation that opens up. Here we see Ravnica really leading the way of this in this drive for experimenting and figuring out the new kind of architecture for the new socialist, self-managing Yugoslavia, continuing the method that he started, but now in a lot more self-conscious and a lot freer mode, bringing in further influences, not just Plečnik and Le Corbusier, but many others as well, and reinterpreting them with much greater freedom than before. His first masterpiece from this period is the cemetery to the victims of the concentration camp at Kampor at the island of Rab in Croatia and up on the northern coast of Croatia, which still sort of oscillates between Plečnik and Le Corbusier, but we no longer really clearly recognize any of the motifs. It's really the strategies that he now applies. Sort of he distills these two influences into a type of knowledge rather than into recognizable motifs, and he starts applying that in his own projects. And here's the model of the cemetery, which has a really interesting layout, if you want. If you look closely, you will see three main parts. There is this entrance sequence here within these stone walls. There's the actual cemetery with graves, with a broken axis down the middle leading towards the sea. And then there's the so-called museum at the very end with this vaulted space at the very end with the mural by the artist Maroje Mrduljaš. The logic of the organization of this space is very Corbusian. Other people have analyzed this closely. I'm not going to repeat that too much. Tomasz Kruszec and William Curtis have really written a very, very beautiful analysis of this project, so I'm really going to quickly repeat their words. The organization really of this space very much follows what Le Corbusier called the promenade architecturale, the architectural promenade, right? The sort of orchestrating the experience of space by carefully guiding the person through this space and sort of coordinating the views of the space, especially of the building onto itself. And here we see, for example, how when you first enter this enclosure here at the entrance, there are several openings in the wall at the other side that offer very staged views of the cemetery. So if you look at this opening to the right, you will notice that it's very closely aligned to that shifted axis at the end, and so on. There's very close coordination of how a person moves through the space and how the space is observed. However, when you get close, the material quality, the tectonics of the space is very much Plečnik's again. There are textures. There's stone, there are these massive monolithic columns, urns, there's this bench. So Ravnica really revels in themes that Plečnik also liked to explore. We could also perhaps speculate now when we see the cemetery several decades after it was built, whether perhaps buildings or spaces like the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm by Gunnar Asplund and Sigurd Leverentz may have actually had something to do with its overgrown with greenery, with individual graves in the forest. Perhaps that might be the case. Ravnica actually very much appreciated Scandinavian architecture. He visited Stockholm as early as 1929. So that's perhaps now another direction that the influence could take in his work. Here we are now on the axis. You see the so-called museum at the bottom. And then there are these two really interesting obelisks that allow the eye to bounce from one to another, right? So we're the promenade architecturale, right? Our tour of the space is guided by these obelisks through space. These obelisks are also really interesting because they show us now Ravnica departing from both Plečnik and from Le Corbusier. If you look at them closely, you will notice that they are really, really improbably thin. They're made out of stone, But stone is a brittle material. It's impossible to build such a tall column to have such slender proportions. How was it held? That's the key trick here. As it turns out, Ravnikar employed a technique that was very much of its moment, something that was just starting to be used around Europe, called the pre-stressing, which means that steel cables were inserted. It's common sense right today, but at the time was something relatively new. Steel cables were inserted through these blocks and then tangent to keep the whole thing together. Without reinforced concrete, without any kind of steel framing, it's really pretty much an improbably slender stone column that he manages to pull off. And finally, when we reach the end, you see the last obelisk, and now this vault, which is again made out of stone, which again is improbably thin, right? The voussoirs are really too thin for the vault to survive. It also contains embedded steel cables that hold this structure in one piece. Against that, really, for the moment, high-tech solution, we see these very, very rustic walls around, kind of contrasting a very ancient and very modern technology. Ravnikar's second masterpiece of the 1950s is a small building in the town of Kranj, not very far from Ljubljana. The municipality building, built for the new self-managed community, right? It's sort of a town hall, but now for a self-managing society. A building that, to me, looked for a very long time very strange. For a very long time, I had a hard time figuring out what he was trying to do, even though Professor Vladimir in Ljubljana wrote that this is the most important building of Slovenian modern architecture, until it finally clicked, really, when I finally started realizing what Ravnikar is really doing here. And he's now, again, pushing this dualism between Corbu and Plečnik even further, and then merging even further influences into his mix. Everything is really unusual about this building, from its layout. It's outside of the historical center of Kranj. There was an existing building at the perimeter of the block, and what Ravnikar did here, rather than enclosing the block, is pushing this main part, the meeting hall that you see in the center, into the middle of the block at kind of an angle. The effect is here, right? We see this sort of temple-like building in the middle of the block, surrounded by the wings around it. Where does this come from now? Again, disparate sources. One would be Corbu. In his famous book, Towards an Architect, right, Vers en Architecture, of 23, there's a famous chapter, 3 reminders to architects, where Le Corbusier discusses how a plan should be laid out, precisely to engage the sense of architectural promenade. And he shows an analysis that the French historian and theorist Auguste Choisy, earlier in the century, actually at the turn of the century, did of the Acropolis. Choisy famously analyzed the Acropolis and how people move around the Acropolis, never really facing the Parthenon. You see the Parthenon to the right. You never face the Parthenon straight on. you always move around. You always see the building obliquely at an angle. And he tells us how ancient Greeks sort of staged this experience of moving around the Parthenon to give you a full 360-degree experience of the building. Unlike the Beaux-Arts architects who really liked putting everything on an axis and everything reveals itself right away. And Corbu is really fascinated with this approach. So look at how Ravnikar positions this main part of the building, right? This temple, right? This Parthenon, right? At an angle. So whichever way you access it, it's always somehow at an angle, and you have to move around to get a sense of space. Perhaps okay, what's also interesting, however, is that here's the overlap, right, with Plečnik and Le Corbusier. Plečnik was also someone who very much appreciated Choisy, taught Choisy in his classes, and was very much aware of the logic of Choisy's argument. So perhaps this is that moment where we find Plečnik and Le Corbusier sort of getting much closer than we would normally assume. Another, perhaps, influence could be Aalto. Ravnikar was very much fascinated with Aalto's work, with kind of the modernist volumes, but sort of broken in their arrangement, not to follow a very rigid perpendicular grid, but to engage with the landscape in a freer, more organic way. As early as his Paimio Sanatorium, we see this arrangement of modernist volumes at different angles other than 90 degrees. So we could perhaps speculate that this was the case here. When we actually look at the building itself, again, it oscillates. A little bit of Corbu, a little bit of Plečnik, but now in a very, very interesting mix. What's interesting about this temple, so-called temple, right, is that in its general contours, it very much follows in the footsteps of Corbu, of Plečnik's sort of reinterpretation of classicism. Look at the very unusual angle of the pediment of the roof, right? It's a very, very shallow pediment. That's not very classical. That's something that Plečnik liked doing. We see it in Prague, at the Church of the Holy Heart, here in the marketplace in Ljubljana. Similar angle here in the municipality of Kranj. Also, the very building type is similar. It's kind of an ancient temple in Antis, right? And a temple that has columns in the middle, but then there are walls to the sides, right? The same story occurs in Ravnikar's interpretation of there. More Plečnik, right? Again, look at the column in the very middle of the span, right? An odd number of columns. Again, against classical rules, against what Alberti tells us, very much something that Plečnik liked using in his projects. However, that's also something that Corbu used in the Villa Savoie, so another overlap, right? There's right in front of the entrance into the Villa Savoie, there's a column, so it's perhaps another overlap in the approach. Did I miss one slide? Yes, I did. Okay, so I want you to also think, however, what this building is, besides being the temple. If you discard this strange pediment, right, what's left is pretty much a box, a glass box on the pilotis, right? So it's a prototypical modernist Corbusian building that's covered with something on top. So again, a hybrid of different sources. Look at the columns. Oops, sorry. Look at these columns on the facade, exposed concrete. oversized conical capitals that seem to be directly taken from the assembly building in Chandigarh by Le Corbusier, except that the proportions are really strange, right? These capitals are much bigger than what in proportion than what Corbu does in Chandigarh. Again, we could now argue that it's Plečnik here talking, where Plečnik, in a number of projects, he liked using these oversized capitals, again, like in the markets in Ljubljana. There are, again, however, all kinds of new interventions, all kinds of new innovations that go beyond this duality. There's the folded plate roof, a very kind of cutting-edge technology of the 1950s. There are all kinds of really interesting metal details throughout the building, such as this door handle at the main entrance, these really interesting lights that Ravnikar custom designed for the building that we could now see coming from different sources. This and I have to thank Professor Kulić for pointing this out, very much, again, resembles Alto, right? The kind of the curvy geometry of these door handle very much resembles Alto's furniture and all kinds of different elements. When we look at the lights, we could perhaps speculate that it's Otto Wagner. The church Steinhof in Vienna, and the Ravnikar's lights are also made out of brass, so it's kind of similar yellowish metal to what Wagner does. In Steinhof, it's like little berries, like the light bulbs are treated as berries, except that they're now more geometricized. Wagner's look like grapes. And I don't know, Ravnikar's lights look like, I don't know, ivy. How is the plant called under which people kiss, right, at Christmas? I forgot. Mistletoe, right, mistletoe, yeah. So it's sort of mistletoe versus grapes. So by this time we see a really mature Ravnikar very freely combining different kinds of influences. I'm just going to jump to his perhaps largest masterpiece, the central space, if you want, of Slovenia's statehood, the Revolution Square, today known as the Republic Square. So it still contains that important national connotation that he built over a very long period of time through several stages between 1960 and 83. The space that's the central public space of Ljubljana with two large towers that also define its skyline. Just quickly, what happens in the meantime? We see him working all over Yugoslavia as well as abroad. This is the Venice project. Here we see him now assimilating the logic of Team 10, of systemic thinking, of megastructures, right? We see that employed in his projects for Skopje after the earthquake. Again, a combination of megastructural thinking. Just look at those skyscrapers at the perimeter. They're really these incredible megastructural objects. However, really strangely combined with a very picturesque thinking, right? So on the one hand, Ravnikar thinks in megastructural terms, but on the other hand, he thinks very much in picturesque terms of Camillo Zite and this kind of small-scale 19th century approach. Here again, we see him designing another megastructure project for Skopje, the town hall for the competition. He won the first prize, but that was never finished. The Revolution Square, as I mentioned, is one of the defining spaces of Ljubljana, and we see here now Ravnikar moving completely away from this duality of Corbu and Plečnik, and now combining really general principles, right? General strategies that are associated with these two, but also with many other architects. You can see how present these two towers are on the skyline of the city. It's the same, the main ceremonial space in Ljubljana. In a way, the whole project started around positioning the monument to the revolution that you see here. During socialist times, large ceremonies like that were organized, but this was also a space where Slovenian statehood independence was proclaimed in 1991. Really, kind of the identity of Slovenia is built into the DNA of this space. Ravnikar won the competition for the space in 1960. We see his original project at the top. Two triangular towers, a vast open area, freestanding towers, pretty much following kind of the paradigmatic logic of Corbu's Radiant City and other projects. Right here we see the Plan Voisin, where Corbu proposed to raise the center of Paris to oppose this new kind of modern space of freestanding buildings to the dense historical fabric around. This logic was very much in total contrast to for example, the logic of Camillo Zitta, the Viennese 19th century theorist, who went in the opposite direction, claiming that new cities, modern cities, should be designed as carefully staged, picturesque rooms. Right? You could not really combine freestanding tower, right, surrounded by greenery, with this kind of approach, where urban space really should be enclosed by buildings, perhaps with one strategically planted tree somewhere kind of off center. In a way, Ravnikar manages to have it both ways, which is really incredible. Right? He manages to have both ends, to have it both freestanding towers that dominate the skyline and have big open space around, and also to have carefully staged urban rooms surrounding this project. Because when you actually see the space now as it was built, you will notice that the towers appear to be freestanding only towards the large square to the north. But they're no longer really freestanding at all towards the remaining fabric. They sort of grow into the remaining fabric. Compare this to this, right? Note how the towers are completely free all around. There's this one single bar towards the square, and every building stands by itself. As the time progressed, as his treatment as his engagement with space progressed, he managed to sort of hybridize and recombine these two very much opposed strategies towards urban space in his treatment of the Revolution Square. Again, note the towers. Note how on the one side they're really open, on the other they're very much grown into the fabric, or the buildings grow around to engage them around. Perhaps as kind of the key moment for developing this solution was when Ravnikar decided to turn the two triangles to face each other. If you look at the first model, you will note that the two towers are turned with their flat sides against each other, which is sort of a neutral way, right? There's not much tension between these two towers. Very soon, however, he turns them point to point, right? Which is much more tense engagement with space. All of a sudden, these two triangular towers become sort of a giant joint between two sides of the square, which we see here. Right? There's this gap now that's much more highlighted than it used to be before. There's a much greater dynamism to the way in which the space is conceived. And we see how this keeps developing through his work. Even though these are among the tallest buildings in Ljubljana, you never have the feeling when you're down at their foot of their full size, because there are these giant cantilevers that provide these protected spaces underneath that kind of introduce a sort of a human scale and engage the person in a lot more subtle way than a typical modernist tower would. Again, Ravnikar very much explored also how adjacent buildings of the complex relate to the surrounding historical fabric of the city. So we see him designing these very carefully staged sketches of a kind of picturesque urban fabric that you would not really normally see in an architect like Le Corbusier, for example, exploring. In a way, I really love that sketch at the top right, because it shows us the parallel that perhaps existed in his mind, where these two modern towers that he designs start serving kind of a similar function as the two Baroque bell towers of the historical fabric. I think that's kind of a very clear analogy that he's trying to tell us with this drawing. So they are modern, they are on a much larger scale, but they participate in the image of the city in a much subtler way than Plan Voisin skyscrapers did. Again, this is the last phase, Tsankariev Dome, which again shows us how everything sort of grows together into kind of a unified urban fabric. Further sketches that really demonstrates his absolutely masterful drafting skills. Again, towers are in the background. Some more. And then the actual urban spaces around, which are now on a much smaller scale than the main square, where you have no awareness of the two big towers behind. Carefully staged, Ravnikar actually designs all the buildings that attach to the sort of broken historical blocks around, and completes these blocks and carefully stages this public space in between his building to the right and the existing historical fabric to the left. Some more. The same space from the other side. Now we're getting closer to the towers, but again, there's always a kind of human dimension to the space wherever you move, except that one monumental moment in the very heart of the square. The language also is extremely diverse. This is in many ways, this is a brutalist building where this we now like to call structural expressionism in exposed concrete really comes forth. One of my favorite moments here, the former bookstore. You see again the lights that he designed, this kind of revision of the lights from Klein. But now combined with claddings and textures that are rarely combined with this kind of exposed concrete brutalist architecture. One way that Ravnikar engaged with this need to clad was through brick. He, throughout the 1960s and the 70s, he really loved playing with brick masonry. Here we see him designing these curved walls that almost look like woven wicker, right? It's almost like a basket, woven basket, which now again through Plečnik takes us back to 19th century Vienna, to the writings of the Viennese theorist Gottfried Zepper, who claimed that the art of architecture really came out of technology and the ornament came out of the art of weaving. Right? So the whole idea of weaving is present in these brick walls. We see all kinds of crazy brick patterns throughout Ravnikar's work in this period. Ferrante Vrt to the top left, and the one to the bottom left and top right are from Cankarev Dom, and finally I think this is from Krajina Hotel, where there's this incredible vocabulary, right, of the ways in which you can lay bricks and create this ornamental effect. This combination of exposed concrete and brick actually is not that unusual, right? The British architects, others around the world use that. What is really unusual in material terms is now a different kind of cladding that Ravnikar does, and that's this stone membrane around the structure, largely in granite, with very highlighted, exposed rivets that attach these slabs to the wall. Again, now we could really, the first reference that comes to mind to everyone is that this is very much the lesson of Otto Wagner. Of course, Wagner is a towering presence through Plečnik, right? Plečnik was Wagner's student. Plečnik was supposed to be Wagner's heir at the chair at the Academy of Arts in Vienna, which he never got. So the path, right, the road is clear and direct. The Postwar in Vienna, right, the famous rivets that many have theorized sort of reverberate in the Revolution Square in Ljubljana. However, again, this sort of influence is really just a starting point for Ravnikar, because this logic of cladding now acquires many different shapes and now starts being hybridized with all kinds of other references. So, for example, on the towers, we see, first of all, a really interesting effect where the slabs are now shifted at 90 degrees towards the facade, right? So you see actually the thickness of the slab, which is very unusual. It's no longer really cladding. It's a sort of a freestanding element. And then the question is, what are these sort of granite fins that he creates here? And we could, you know, all kinds of logical references from the period start asserting themselves. Is that maybe kind of a reinterpretation of Corbusier and Brissot, right? Or is it perhaps the reinterpretation of Mies van der Rohe's mullions, right, that we see on curtain walls, but now executed in a completely unexpected material? Finally, the last phase, the Cankarev Dome, creates a complete shift of reference just by changing the color, right? The granite, gray granite becomes white, and all of a sudden we start recognizing Aalto, right? Late work by Aalto, the Finlandia Hall, even perhaps even more the Aalto Theater in Essen, that was not built really until the 80s, but Ravnikar probably knew about the original project from 1959. The combination of white thin stone slabs, copper cladding of the roofs. We see some of that here in Cankarev Dome. Look at now again the kind of the game he plays with cladding. However, there is a sense of even greater formal richness of an extreme a level of formal articulation that goes perhaps even beyond what Aalto was doing. This is one of my favorite moments that really captures the strategies that he applies throughout the building, but here really highlighted to the extreme. This big window where we see these ripples of the wall culminating in the opening in the middle that has almost a Baroque feeling, right? This is no longer really alto, this is not Plecnik, this is not Le Corbusier. There's this kind of really exalted formal effect that perhaps could be linked to Baroque, which is not at all illogical, considering that actually historically Ljubljana is very much a Baroque city. The references to Baroque bell towers in Arabic sketches, perhaps where the towers play the role of modern counterpart to Baroque bell towers, perhaps does really translate into also the logic of the surface and into this extremely exalted formal effect, ultimately tying kind of a full circle of Ljubljana's history from Baroque to Plecnik or Vienna to Plecnik to the Corbusier alto and back to the very beginning. This is where I finally finish, and I thank you for your attention.